Today we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. As always, viewer discretion is advised. High in the misty hills of Kodaikanal, Tamil Nadu, at an elevation of 7,317 feet, 2,230 meters above sea level, there's a place that locals refuse to visit after dark. They call it the Devil's Kitchen, though tourists know it by a different name, the Guna Caves. The caves weren't always called Guna. For generations, they were known simply as the Devil's Kitchen, a network of massive granite boulders stacked precariously on top of each other, creating narrow passages, dark chambers, and hidden pits that drop straight down into the mountain's core. Then, in 1991, a psychological thriller named Guna was filmed there, and since then, the name stuck. The movie made the caves famous, but fame didn't make them any less deadly. By 2006, 13 people had fallen into the caves and never come out. The bodies of most were never recovered. Local guides would tell you stories about how the caves seemed to call to people, how visitors would wander away from their groups, drawn deeper into the darkness until they simply disappeared. The forest department had put up fences. They'd installed warning signs. But the signs were in Tamil, and most tourists couldn't read them. What made the Guna Caves so deadly wasn't just one thing. It was everything. The moss-covered rocks were slippery. The passages were confusing, turning back on themselves. And scattered throughout were holes in the cave floor, some barely visible in the dim light, that dropped straight down for over 100 feet into chambers no one had ever fully explored. If you fell into one of those pits, you weren't coming back. The rescue teams had tried before. It never worked. That was the reputation of the Devil's Kitchen on September 3rd, 2006, when 9 friends from Manjummal, Kerala, decided to visit. They called themselves the Manjummal Boys, a tight-knit group of painters and workers from the Darshana Arts Club near Kochi. They had grown up together, played together, worked together. This Onam vacation was supposed to be their big adventure, a celebration of their friendship. They pooled their money and headed to the hill station of Kodaikanal. Siju David, nicknamed Kutan, was the unofficial leader. At 26, he was older than most of the others. Then there was 19-year-old Subhash Chandran, quiet, artistic, the youngest in the group. That morning, before leaving for the caves, Subhash had grabbed his younger brother's belt from the wall. There had been a brief argument between the siblings over it. Such a small, stupid thing. But everything happens for a reason that dictates our future and our end. The group arrived at the Guna Caves around midday. The place was stunning. Massive boulders creating cathedral-like spaces, shafts of sunlight breaking through the gaps, the whole area shrouded in that famous Kodaikanal mist. They saw the fence. It was broken in places, easy to cross. They saw the warning sign, but it was in Tamil. They were from Kerala. They couldn't read it. So they went in. At first, it was everything they'd hoped for. They explored the chambers, took photos, carved Manjummal Boys 2006 into one of the rock walls. The caves felt like their own private adventure, a story they'd tell for years. While the guys were exploring, they suddenly realized that when they arrived, they were a total of 9 people. Now, they are 8. Subhash had vanished. One moment he was there. The next moment, just gone, without any sound or anything. Abhilash John was the first to notice. He'd been standing next to Subhash, and suddenly there was just empty space. The group rushed over. There, in the cave floor where Subhash had been standing, was a hole, maybe 3 feet, 1 meter across, irregular, the edges hidden by shadows and moss. They shined their phone lights into it. The beams disappeared into blackness. No bottom. No sound of impact. Just nothing. Someone shouted to him to stop fooling around and that the joke's over. But no one laughed. They all knew. Subhash wasn't joking. Some of the friends ran for help while others stayed, calling into the hole, hoping for a response. They ran to the nearby shop, breathless and terrified. The shopkeeper, Arumugam, listened to their story, and all the color drained from his face. "Devil's Kitchen," he said quietly. "Nobody comes back from there. 13 people have fallen in." He didn't finish the sentence but made a gesture that said their friend was now one of them. However, he agreed to show them back to the spot. Meanwhile, other friends were at the police station, trying to explain what happened. The police inspector's first reaction wasn't sympathy. It was suspicion. He thought they'd murdered their friend and were staging an accident. But then it was evident that this wasn't the case. By the time authorities arrived at the caves, hours had passed. Rain had started falling, cold and heavy. The police, fire department, and forest officials stood around the hole, shaking their heads. A fire service officer lowered a rope and called down into the darkness. It was more procedure than hoped. Everyone there knew the reputation of this place. Then they heard it. Faint, weak, barely human, but unmistakable. A cry from deep below. Subhash was alive. Previously, he had stepped forward, unaware that the rock beneath him was slick with moisture and loose soil. His foot pressed down, and in an instant, the ground gave way. There was no time to shout, no moment to react. The earth crumbled soundlessly, and his body slipped through the narrow gap, vanishing into darkness. He fell silently, arms scraping against the jagged walls, trying to grab something, anything, to stop the fall. But the shaft was too tight, the rock too smooth. But then, with a violent jolt, his belt, the same belt for which he had an argument with his brother, caught on a protruding edge. The force twisted him sideways, slamming his shoulder and head against the wall. Pain exploded through him, but it also stopped the fall and saved his life during that time. Now, probably wedged deep inside the crevice, motionless and breathless, he could barely move. After he was located, the officials estimated, based on how faint his voice sounded, that he'd fallen at least 120 feet, 36.5 meters down. That's a 12-story building, a fall that should have killed him instantly. Somehow, impossibly, he'd survived just because of that belt. However, he was still stuck deep inside and was on borrowed time. But the officer in charge pulled David aside and told him something that made his blood run cold. 10 years ago, a central minister's nephew fell into this same hole. They brought in special forces, expert rescue teams, every resource the government could provide, but they still couldn't save him and never even found his body. The message was clear. Subhash might be alive now, but he wouldn't be for long, and anyone who tried to go down after him would just add another body to the count. The firemen tried everything they could from the surface. They lowered a longer rope, calling for Subhash to tie it around himself. No response. He'd lost consciousness. They discussed pumping oxygen down. They discussed calling for specialized equipment from other cities. But everyone there knew the truth. By the time any of that arrived, Subhash would be dead. David stood there watching these professional rescuers. These men trained to save lives, and not one of them was willing to go down. They were terrified, and they had every right to be. But David wanted to save his friend, so he decided that he'd go in. The police immediately protested. They told him he's not trained. The oxygen levels down there would kill him. But David was determined. He wasn't going back on his words. What happened next would be described as either the bravest or the most foolish thing anyone at the Guna Caves had ever witnessed. David tied a 50-foot, 15-meter rope around his waist. He grabbed a small flashlight, and at roughly 4 p.m., 3 hours after Subhash had fallen, he lowered himself into the Devil's Kitchen. The descent was immediately nightmarish. The hole was barely wide enough for his shoulders. The walls were slick with moisture and covered in moss and bat droppings. It was cold. The smell was overwhelming. Decay and ammonia and something ancient. His flashlight revealed glimpses of the vertical shaft, jagged rocks, places where the passage narrowed to almost nothing, then opened into larger chambers. At around 60 feet, 18 meters down, David turned off his flashlight. The bats. There were hundreds of them, disturbed by his presence, their wings beating chaos in the confined space. The sound was disorienting, terrifying. He kept descending in pitch darkness, one hand on the rope, one hand touching the slimy walls. The first rope ran out. David was dangling in absolute blackness, still nowhere near the bottom. His friends above shouted down, asking if he was okay. The police told him to come back up. It was too dangerous to continue. But David could hear Subhash, so he was not planning to give up. There was a long pause. Then they tied another rope to the first one and kept lowering him into the darkness. At approximately 120 feet, 36.5 meters down, deeper than any rescue attempt had ever gone in the Guna Caves, David's flashlight finally found Subhash. He was lying on a narrow rock ledge, maybe 3 feet, 1 meter wide, jutting out from the shaft wall. His body was twisted, blood covered his face and clothes. He was lying in a pool of black water, but his chest was moving. He was breathing. David carefully maneuvered onto the ledge. The space was barely big enough for one person. One wrong move, and they'd both plummet into the deeper darkness below. Subhash's eyes snapped open, wild, terrified, not recognizing anything. In his traumatized state, he saw only a figure in the darkness. In the darkness below, David managed to calm Subhash enough to make him understand. He tied the rope around Subhash's torso and signaled to the surface that they were ready. The ascent took another hour. Every foot was agony. The rope scraped against rocks. Both men bumped against the walls, reopening wounds. Subhash kept passing out, but then came back to consciousness. At one point, the rope snagged on an outcropping, and they were stuck. They thought, this is it, and now it's going to be impossible to get out. However, hanging in darkness, David worked to free it, and then the ascent continued. But inch by inch, they rose from the Devil's Kitchen. When they finally emerged, nearly 6 hours after Subhash had fallen, a cheer went up from the crowd that had gathered. Subhash was rushed to the hospital, unconscious but alive. David collapsed, his hands shredded, his body shaking. What none of them knew was that they'd just achieved the impossible. Subhash Chandran had become the first and only person in history to fall into the depths of the Guna Caves and come out alive. What happened? After, well, the Manjumal boys were charged with trespassing in a prohibited area and fined 2,500 rupees. More painfully, they agreed among themselves not to tell anyone the full story. When people asked about Subhash's injuries, they said he'd fallen from a waterfall. They thought they were protecting him, protecting his family. Subhash spent 60 days recovering, but the physical wounds healed faster than the psychological ones. He suffered nightmares so severe he needed trauma therapy for 6 months. And his mother blamed David. She didn't know he'd saved her son's life. She only knew Subhash had gone on a trip with David and come back broken. But eventually, the truth came out. When Subhash's mother learned what really happened, she broke down crying, apologizing to David. In 2008, Siju David received the Jeevan Raksha Padak, India's civilian award for bravery from the president at the time. In September 1985, 5 young people decided to spend the night camping in a shelter cave near the Platte River, south of Omaha, Nebraska. Their plans, however, didn't go as planned. Shelter caves are exactly what they sound like: natural reef overhangs or shallow caves that provide protection from the elements without requiring you to venture deep underground. They have been used by humans for thousands of years as temporary camping spots, offering a roof overhead and protection from wind and rain while still being open to the outside air. The shelter cave near the Platte River, south of Omaha, was one of these formations, a rock overhang in the bluffs along the river. These kinds of formations are common in river valleys where water and weather have carved out overhangs in the rock faces over centuries. In September 1985, a group of 5 young people decided this shelter cave would be the perfect spot for a camping trip. The group included Michael Wiles, who was just 12 years old, his older brother Mark Wiles, who was 18, and their friend David Funkhauser, who was 17. 2 other youths whose names weren't recorded in the accounts were also part of the camping group. For young people in Nebraska in the 1980s, camping in a shelter cave probably seemed like an ideal outdoor adventure. You got the experience of sleeping in nature with the added excitement of camping under a rock overhang, and you didn't need any special equipment or training like you would for deep cave exploration. It was accessible adventure that felt more interesting than just camping in a tent. The group arrived at the shelter cave in the late afternoon with their camping gear and supplies. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, September nights in Nebraska can get quite cool, the group decided to build a campfire. They gathered firewood from the area and built their fire near the mouth of the shelter cave, where smoke could escape while still providing warmth to the space where they were sleeping. The campfire burned as the group sat around it, probably telling stories, eating their camping food, and enjoying the experience of spending a night in a shelter cave. Eventually, as the night grew late, the 5 young people settled into their sleeping bags beneath the rock overhang. The campfire was still burning, or had burned down to coals, providing residual heat to the shelter cave. They felt safe and comfortable. They were under a solid rock ceiling that had presumably been stable for centuries, and they were together as a group in a popular camping spot. But what the group didn't understand, what they had no way of knowing, was that they had created a deadly combination of circumstances that was slowly destabilizing the rock ceiling above them. 2 forces were at work: groundwater seepage and heat from the campfire, and together they were compromising the structural integrity of the overhang. Groundwater had been seeping through the rock layers above the shelter cave, probably for a long time. This constant moisture infiltration was gradually weakening the rock, working into cracks and joints in the stone, expanding and contracting with temperature changes, slowly turning solid rock into something more fragile. In geological terms, this process is called weathering, and it's how rock formations eventually break down and collapse. The heat from the campfire added another destabilizing factor. When rock is heated, it expands. When it cools, it contracts. This constant expansion and contraction creates stress within the rock structure, particularly along existing cracks and weak points. A campfire burning beneath a rock ceiling creates a significant temperature differential between the heated rock surface and the cooler rock behind it, amplifying these stresses. The combination of weakened rock from groundwater seepage and thermal stress from the fire was creating a situation where a large section of the cave ceiling was becoming increasingly unstable. But there was no visible warning, no creaking sounds, no falling pebbles to alert the sleeping campers that anything was wrong. The rock above them looked solid and permanent, as it had for generations of people who had sheltered beneath it. Then, without any warning whatsoever, catastrophe struck. A massive slab of the cave ceiling suddenly gave way and collapsed. One moment, 5 young people were sleeping peacefully beneath what appeared to be a solid rock overhang. The next moment, tons of rock and debris came crashing down on top of them. The collapse happened with devastating speed and force. The rock slab, weighing several tons, fell directly onto the sleeping area where the 5 young people were positioned. The impact was tremendous, and there was no time for anyone to react or try to escape. 3 of the 5 campers were directly beneath the falling rock slab when it collapsed. Michael Wiles, the 12-year-old boy, was crushed instantly beneath the falling debris. His 18-year-old brother, Mark, who was responsible for organizing the camping trip and looking after his younger brother, was killed in the same instant. Their friend David Funkhauser, the 17-year-old, also died beneath the falling rock. The 2 other youths in the group somehow escaped being crushed by the collapsing ceiling. Whether they were sleeping in a different area of the shelter that wasn't directly beneath the failing section, or whether they were just incredibly lucky in how the rock fell, they survived the collapse. But they were now trapped in a nightmare scenario. 3 of their friends had just been crushed to death by falling rock right next to them, and they were surrounded by tons of fallen debris in a partially collapsed shelter cave. The 2 survivors were in complete shock, unable to fully process what had just happened. They tried desperately to dig through the rubble to reach Michael, Mark, and David, hoping against hope that their friends might somehow have survived beneath the fallen rock. But the weight of the collapsed slab was enormous, far too heavy for 2 teenagers to move without equipment and help. The 2 survivors eventually had to make their way out of the partially collapsed shelter cave and seek help. When rescue workers and emergency personnel arrived at the shelter cave, they found a devastating scene. The rock overhang that had seemed like a perfect camping spot had partially collapsed, with a massive slab of ceiling now lying where the sleeping area had been. The bodies of Michael Wiles, Mark Wiles, and David Funkhauser were crushed beneath the rock, and recovery of their remains would require careful work with heavy equipment to lift the collapsed slab. The investigation into what caused the collapse identified the deadly combination of factors. Groundwater seepage had been weakening the rock structure over time, and the heat from the campfire the boys had used had created thermal stress that provided the final trigger for the collapse. For the two survivors, the psychological trauma of that night would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had watched 3 friends die in an instant, crushed by falling rock while sleeping in what was supposed to be a safe camping spot. The randomness of who lived and who died, determined simply by where each person had been sleeping,